When Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, and Ray Allen linked up in Boston in 2007, they won a championship in their first season together.
Anything's possible!
When LeBron, D. Wade, and Bosh teamed up in Miami, they went to 4 straight finals and even brought home 2 titles. Those are the big 3 stories that everybody loves to tell. And honestly, they deserve every bit of praise that they get. But this isn't one of those videos. This is about the teams that had just as much talent, just as much hype, just as many people convinced that they were about to take over the league and completely fell apart. We're talking about franchises that spent hundreds of millions of dollars, gave away draft picks they're still missing today, and in some cases blew up their entire future for a run that lasted 1 season or less. Some of these stories are painful, and a few of them are kind of hilarious when you see how badly it all went wrong.
Get up! Come on, get up if you're psyched as I am!
These are the big 3s that didn't just fail. They crashed, they burned, and they left a mess that took years to clean up. This is the story of the worst big 3s in NBA history. Let's start with the Los Angeles Lakers, because if you want to talk about a big 3 that had absolutely no business failing the way it did, this is the one. Because the story of this roster doesn't start with a trade, it actually starts with a trade that never happened. It's December 2011, and the Lakers had just agreed to a deal that would have sent Chris Paul from the league-owned New Orleans Hornets to the Los Angeles Lakers. This wasn't speculation. The deal was done. Chris Paul, Kobe Bryant, and Pau Gasol all in Los Angeles. The league was buzzing, and then Commissioner David Stern, who was overseeing the Hornets at the time since the league owned the franchise, stepped in and vetoed the entire thing. He called it a basketball decision, said it wasn't in the best interest of New Orleans as a franchise. The trade was dead. Chris Paul ended up going to the Clippers instead, and the Lakers were left with nothing. What makes this even harder to swallow is that Stern admitted years later that the Lakers could have still gotten Chris Paul if they were willing to rework the deal. But the front office panicked. 3 days after the veto, their GM shipped Lamar Odom off to Dallas for a trade exception, which removed the exact salary piece they needed to restructure the offer. If only they were just a little bit patient. So the Lakers pivoted. In the summer of 2012, they worked out a sign and trade deal with the Phoenix Suns to bring in Steve Nash, a 2-time MVP who at this point is 38 years old. Nash signed a 3-year, $27 million deal, and the Lakers sent Phoenix a couple first-round picks to get the deal done. Then just weeks later, they pull off a 14 blockbuster trade involving the Magic, the 76ers, and the Nuggets, all to land All-NBA center Dwight Howard. The key piece going out of the door is Andrew Bynum, their 24-year-old all-star center. Pau Gasol stays, no first-round picks leave, and suddenly the Lakers have Kobe Bryant, Steve Nash, Pau Gasol, and Dwight Howard all on the same roster. Vegas immediately named them title favorites. The city was electric, and the expectations couldn't have been higher. And then everything fell apart almost immediately. 5 games into the season, Coach Mike Brown got fired. The Lakers went 1-4 to start the season off, and the ownership decided to pull the plug. Now, at this point, most people assumed Phil Jackson was walking through that door. He had coached Kobe to 5 championships. The relationship was there, and it made all the sense in the world. Instead, Jim Buss made the call to hire Mike D'Antoni, whose up-tempo pace and space system was about as far from Dwight Howard's strengths as you could possibly get. Dwight Howard was a back-to-the-basket, lob-catching, rim-running center who was also still recovering from back surgery he had earlier that year. Asking him to operate as a floor spacing, screen and roll big in D'Antoni's system was never going to work. Howard clashed with D'Antoni constantly, struggled with his role, and his relationship with Kobe deteriorated publicly. Kobe was Kobe, demanding and intense in a way that works when a team is winning and becomes suffocating when it isn't. Reports surfaced of Kobe laying into Howard in the locker room, telling him to grow up and step up, calling him soft repeatedly, and Howard simply wasn't built for that kind of environment. Meanwhile, Nash, who was supposed to be the engine that made this whole thing run, broke his leg in just the 2nd game of the season and was never the same player from that point forward. The Lakers limped through the year, won enough games late to barely scrape into the playoffs as the 7th seed at 45-37. And then suddenly in game 80, with 2 games left in the regular season, Kobe went down with a torn Achilles tendon in a moment that felt like the universe putting an end to the whole experiment. Without him, the Lakers were swept out of the first round by the San Antonio Spurs. Dwight was even ejected in game 4. It was as ugly as an ending you could write for a team that had been picked by so many to win the whole thing. The aftermath of the situation was just as grim. Howard left that summer and signed a max contract with the Houston Rockets. Nash played just 65 games over his final 2 seasons with the team before retiring. Kobe fought back from the Achilles, tore his knee the following year, and played 3 more painful, diminishing seasons before retiring later in 2016. The Lakers missed the playoffs 6 straight years after that roster fell apart, the longest drought in franchise history. All of it traces back to that December night in 2011 when Stern picked up the phone, killed a trade that was already agreed upon, and set off a chain of events that this franchise spent nearly a decade recovering from. Now, the Lakers situation was bad, but at least you can point to specific things that went wrong and trace the cracks from the beginning. What happened in Brooklyn a decade later was something different entirely. This was a roster that looked like it might have been the most offensively talented team ever assembled, and watching it collapse in real time was one of the most bizarre things the NBA has ever produced. It started in the summer of 2019, when Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving both chose the Brooklyn Nets as free agents. Durant was coming off of a ruptured Achilles in the NBA Finals, so everyone understood that he wasn't going to play his first season in Brooklyn. But the move itself sent shockwaves through the league. Two stars of that caliber choosing a franchise that hadn't been relevant in decades was a statement. And then in January of 2021, they made the move that turned this from a promising situation into a generational super team. They traded for none other than James Harden. It took a 4-team deal involving the Nets, the Rockets, the Cavaliers, and the Pacers to get it done. And what Brooklyn gave up to make it happen was staggering. They sent Houston 3 unprotected first-round picks, 4 unprotected pick swaps, and a collection of young players including Karis LeVert and Jared Allen. At the time, it felt worth it because the trio they were putting on the floor was genuinely hard to comprehend. 3 of the most skilled offensive players the league has ever seen, all in their primes, all on the same team.
Harden, a 3 is good.
The Nets were immediately installed as championship favorites, and the basketball world was all sitting watching. But the problem started almost right away. Durant was still finding his rhythm coming back after the Achilles. Kyrie, who had already developed a reputation for being complicated, began missing games for what the team described as personal reasons. And Harden, who had just forced his way out of Houston, was trying to learn a new system while carrying an enormous offensive load. The 3 of them played just 8 games together in that entire first season. And yet somehow Brooklyn still had the second best record in the East and pushed all the way to the second round of the playoffs against Milwaukee.
Gets it into Durant. Here is Durant moving on Tucker. He turns, he shoots. Yes! With 1 second remaining, Durant hits a 3.
Durant put up one of the greatest individual playoff performances in NBA history, scoring 49 points in Game 5 and then 48 in Game 7. And at the end of regulation in that Game 7, he pulled up for what would have been a series-winning 3-pointer at the buzzer. The shot went in. The building erupted. And then they looked at the replay and saw that his toe was on the line, which meant it counted as 2, which meant the game went into overtime. The Bucks won. It didn't help that Kyrie Irving was also playing hurt, but it was still the kind of loss that stung deeply, but also gave you some hope, because when those 3 were healthy and locked in, they were nearly unbeatable. Then came the 2021-22 season, and any hope that remained evaporated quickly. New York City introduced a mandate that barred unvaxxed individuals from entering indoor arenas, and Kyrie Irving refused to get it. The Nets tried everything, held out for months hoping that he would change his mind.
Would love to just keep that private and handle it the right way with my team and go forward.
And eventually they decided to just bring him back as a part-time player, available only for road games. Think about that for a second. One of the 3 stars of your championship roster was physically unable to play in your own building. The locker room splintered. The team was inconsistent all season. And in February, Harden had seen enough. He forced yet another trade to Philadelphia. And just like that, that trio was done. They never played a full season together. The Nets ended up limping into the playoffs and got swept by Boston in the first round, with Durant averaging over 26 points and getting almost nothing from the supporting cast around him. That summer, Durant requested a trade himself. The situation with Kyrie wasn't getting any better, and by February of 2023, the whole thing was completely dismantled. Kyrie went to Dallas, Durant went to Phoenix, and Brooklyn was left holding the bill for one of the most expensive failed experiments in sports history. The Nets ended up spending the next several seasons at the bottom of the standings with nothing to show for it. They're still paying for this trade 5 years later.
And only got 1 playoff series win. It's because they made promises they didn't keep.
And here's where this story takes a turn that is almost too wild to believe, because Brooklyn didn't just mortgage their future once for a big 3 that fell apart. They had done the exact same thing almost a decade earlier. Same franchise, different stars, same result. You'd think they would have learned their lesson the first time around. Back in 2013, the Brooklyn Nets were a brand new franchise in a brand new building, and the owner had made a very public promise to Brooklyn that they would win a championship within 5 years.
A little bit luck, a little bit money, and we go straight to the top.
He meant it too, because what the Nets did that summer to make good on that promise was one of the most aggressive roster moves in NBA history. They called up the Boston Celtics and essentially said, what's it going to take? And Boston, who were in the middle of a quiet rebuild after their championship window had closed, told them exactly what it would take. On June 27th of 2013, Brooklyn had sent a package to Boston that included Gerald Wallace, a handful of role players, and most critically, 3 unprotected first-round picks in 2014, 16, and 18. In return, they get Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce, 2 future Hall of Famers who were 36 and 35 years old respectively, along with Jason Terry. They already had Darren Williams, who they had traded for 2 years earlier, and Joe Johnson, who they had taken on in a separate deal. Brooklyn looked like a legitimate contender, but what nobody wanted to say out loud was that Garnett and Pierce were old. Garnett's back had been breaking for years. Pierce was on the back 9 of his career, and Darren Williams, who was supposed to be the engine of the whole operation, was dealing with chronic ankle issues that had quietly robbed him of his explosiveness that made him an all-star in Utah. First-year head coach Jason Kidd, who had literally just retired as a player, was learning on the job in one of the most pressure-filled situations imaginable. And well, it showed. The Nets went 44-38 that season, scraped into the playoffs as the 6th seed, and beat the Toronto Raptors in a hard-fought 7-game first-round series. Then they ran into the Miami Heat in the second round and lost in just 5 games. Pierce and Garnett were shadows of their former self by that point. Pierce left in free agency that summer. Kidd bolted for Milwaukee after a bizarre power struggle with the front office, and Garnett was eventually traded back to Minnesota mid-season the following year. The whole thing lasted just 1 playoff run, 1 second-round appearance. That was it. But the real damage wasn't what happened on the court. It was what happened off of it. Remember those picks that Brooklyn sent to Boston? The 2016 pick became Jaylen Brown at number 3 overall. The 2017 swap Boston used to move up became a part of the path to drafting Jason Tatum at number 3. The 2018 pick continued filtering through deals that helped Boston stockpile assets for years, while Brooklyn was sitting in the lottery with no way to rebuild. Paul Pierce himself once joked that he went to Brooklyn and changed the culture of, well, the Celtics. And as much as that stings for Nets fans, he wasn't wrong. 11 years after that trade was made, Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum both won the NBA championship together in Boston. The 2 players whose draft slots came directly from Brooklyn's desperation move. Same franchise, different decade, same ending. And speaking of franchises that couldn't escape their own bad habits, the Los Angeles Clippers had quietly assembled one of the most entertaining rosters in the league. And for a few years there, watching them play was must-see television. Blake Griffin was one of the most explosive athletes the sport had ever seen. DeAndre Jordan was turned into one of the most dominant rebounders and lob targets in the game. And then in December of 2011, the same month David Stern was vetoing trades across town, the Clippers had landed Chris Paul. And the way they got him is worth mentioning, because it connects directly to the Lakers story that we had just told. After Stern killed the CP3 to LA deal, the league worked out a new trade that sent Paul to the Clippers instead, with New Orleans getting Eric Gordon, Chris Kaman, Al-Farouq Aminu, and a first-round pick in return. The Lakers watched their division rival land the point guard that they had been promised, and there was nothing they could do about it. Paul immediately transformed the Clippers from a punchline franchise into a legitimate contender, and Lob City was born.
Griffin will turn, shoot a 3 for the win. Bounce. It goes. He got it. The Clippers win. It goes.
The alley-oops, the highlight dunks, the Cliff Paul commercials, the sold-out Staples Center crowds that had never shown up for this team before. It was a special moment for a franchise that had spent decades in the shadow of the Lakers, and the basketball was as fun to watch as anything in the league. But fun and winning championships are 2 different things, and the Clippers never quite bridged that gap. They made the playoffs 6 straight seasons with that core and never once reached the conference finals. And the story of why comes down to a combination of playoff collapses, injuries at the worst possible moments, and a locker room by multiple accounts that was more fractured than the outside world ever knew.
Down to 2, trying to get it down low, and Ibaka took it away. It's all over. The Oklahoma.
The most painful moment came in 2015. The Clippers had just beaten the San Antonio Spurs in a 7-game first-round classic, with Chris Paul hitting one of the most memorable buzzer beaters you'll ever see in a Game 7. They took that momentum into the second round against the Houston Rockets and built a 3-1 series lead. They were 1 win away from the conference finals. And then it all came apart in a way that nobody who watched it will ever forget. They were up 87-68 in the third quarter of Game 6 in LA. The Clippers were outscored 40-15 down the stretch and lost the game. Then they went to Houston for Game 7 and lost that one too. It remains one of the most staggering collapses in playoff history, and it effectively ended any perception of the Clippers as true contenders. I'm still unsure why Doc Rivers continues to get coaching jobs. The tension within that roster had been building for years by that point. Paul and Griffin reportedly had a complicated relationship, with Paul's demanding point guard style grinding on the more laid-back Griffin in ways that never fully resolved. The hack-a-DJ strategy that opposing teams used against DeAndre Jordan had become a serious liability in close games. And Doc Rivers, who was both coach and president of basketball operations, was caught between managing egos, managing rotations, and managing a front office that was running out of patience. In the summer of 2017, Chris Paul forced his way out, and the Clippers traded him to Houston. A few months later, Griffin was dealt to Detroit in a move that shocked everybody, including Griffin himself, who had just signed a maxed extension with the team. DeAndre Jordan left in free agency the following summer. 7 years, 6 playoff appearances, 0 conference finals. That was the Lob City era in its entirety. What makes this story particularly interesting is that the Clippers took everything they learned from this era and turned around and tried to build another super team almost immediately. And somehow, against all odds, they found a way to spend even more money and come away with even less. And before we move on, I have to show you guys something really cool. We all grew up ripping packs, right? Tearing through that wrapper, have your heart pounding and hoping you hit something insane. That feeling never went away. We just grew up and instead convinced ourselves that it was somehow childish. Courtyard brought it back and made it smarter. Courtyard is a marketplace where you can open packs, own real physical collectibles, and trade them instantly around the world without ever touching a box, buying a stamp, or praying that the guy on eBay isn't scamming you. Your cards sit in their vault, fully insured at market value, stored for free in a temperature-controlled facility. And when you want the physical item, they'll just ship it to you. And I feel like I have to mention this, but there's no buyer fees, no seller fees. Authenticity is guaranteed on everything. They have Pokemon cards, sports cards, comic books, pretty much everything, and yet there's still more coming. And every pack you get comes with a guaranteed buyback offer at fair market value. So if you open something and it's not for you, you can sell it back instantly. Courtyard is pioneering the next generation of commerce through gamified shopping, and it's actually insanely cool. So make sure you go to courtyard.io and use my code JZUncut15 to get 15% off your next order. Again, the code is JZUncut15, or use the QR code, or use the link down in the description. Major thanks again to Courtyard for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back to it. In the summer of 2019, the Los Angeles Clippers made 2 moves on the same day that completely changed the landscape of the NBA. Kawhi Leonard, the 2-time Finals MVP who had just beaten the Warriors in Toronto and walked away from the Raptors in free agency, chose the Clippers over the Lakers. But then on that same day, the Clippers pulled off a trade to bring in Paul George from Oklahoma City.
I love the toughness. 2 guys who every year have gotten better.
And the price they paid for him was the kind of number that makes your jaw drop when you see it all laid out. To get Paul George, the Clippers sent OKC Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Danilo Gallinari, 4 unprotected first-round picks, 1 protected first, and 2 pick swaps. SGA was 21 years old at the time and had just shown flashes of being something special in his rookie season. The Thunder took all of those assets and used them as the foundation of a rebuild that, within 5 years, produced one of the best teams in the league. SGA became an MVP and a long-term MVP candidate. OKC stockpiled so many picks that they were essentially running a small draft operation. All because the Clippers wanted Paul George. At the time, it sort of made some sense. Kawhi and PG were considered one of the most dangerous duos in basketball. 2 elite two-way wings who could defend anyone and score from anywhere. The plan was to add a 3rd star to push them over the top. And James Harden, who had been unhappy in Houston for years, was the target. But Harden didn't come until October of 2023, which meant the window that everyone assumed would open immediately kept getting pushed back by somebody nobody saw coming, which was, of course, Kawhi Leonard's own body. Kawhi's injury history during this period was brutal. He tore his ACL in the 2nd round of the 2021 playoffs and missed the entire 21 to 22 season. He came back in 22-23 and played 52 games before his knee flared up again. In the 2023 first round against Phoenix, he played limited minutes and was clearly compromised. By the time Harden finally arrived, Paul George had played alongside Kawhi for 4 seasons and they never once made it past the 2nd round together. Despite that one conference finals appearance in 2021 coming under the most unusual circumstances imaginable. That run happened inside the NBA bubble with no crowd, no home court advantage, and Kawhi and PG grinding through a bracket that opened up just enough to let them through before the Suns shut the door in 5 games. Then James Harden arrived and brought his own baggage with him.
I'm not a system player. I am a system. You know what I mean? So
he spent months publicly calling Sixers GM Daryl Morey a liar in China and other promotional appearances. He ended up landing in LA, linked up with Kawhi and PG, and the trio that everyone had been waiting years to see finally existed for about 8 months. Because in July 2024, Paul George opted out of his contract and signed a max deal with the Philadelphia 76ers, the same team Harden had just left. The irony was not lost on anyone. So the Clippers went into 2024-2025 with Kawhi and Harden as their 2 primary stars. stars, and even that couldn't hold together cleanly. Kawhi dealt with knee inflammation throughout the year, playing limited minutes and sitting out stretches that left the team treading water without him. They still managed to win 50 games and make the playoffs as the 5th seed, and they pushed the Denver Nuggets all the way to Game 7 in the first round. So Harden struggled badly when it mattered most, scoring just 7 points on 2 of 8 shooting in the elimination game. And the Clippers went home once again without the deep run they had spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars trying to manufacture. When you add all of this up, the Clippers gave away SGA and a generation of draft picks they're still paying today, paid some of the largest luxury tax bills in NBA history, and the best they could produce with all of it was one bubble conference finals and a string of early exits. From LA, we head to Oklahoma City, because before the Thunder became the model franchise that the Clippers helped build with all of those picks, they had their own super team moment that lasted exactly 1 season and ended in complete embarrassment. Oklahoma City is one of the smallest markets in the NBA, and for most of their history as the Thunder, they punched well above their weight by drafting brilliantly and developing players the right way. From Kevin Durant to Russell Westbrook to James Harden, all drafted and built in OKC. And then Durant left for Golden State in 2016 and broke the city's heart in a way that still stings a decade later. Westbrook stayed, won the MVP averaging a triple-double for the entire season, and carried a 47-win team almost entirely on his back.
Westbrook, the crossover drive, and throws it down. There it is, that nuclear athleticism from Russell Westbrook.
It was one of the most remarkable individual seasons the sport had seen in years, and it deserved better than just a first-round exit against Houston. So the following summer, Sam Presti went to work. He pulled off a trade with the Indiana Pacers to bring in Paul George, and the price was surprisingly reasonable given what George was worth. By the way, off topic, have you guys noticed the repeat names that we've said in this video? Indiana had limited leverage because George had already told them that he planned to leave for the Lakers in free agency the following summer. So OKC was able to get him for Victor Oladipo and Domantas Sabonis. No first-round picks were involved. It was widely considered one of the best value trades of that era. Then just a few weeks later, the Thunder added Carmelo Anthony, who had requested a trade out of New York and waived his trade kicker to make the deal work, coming over for a package of role players and a second-round pick. Suddenly, OKC had 3 former All-Stars, a reigning MVP, and a city that was buzzing again. The problem was immediately obvious to anyone watching closely. All 3 of them needed the ball. Westbrook was at his best when he had the freedom to attack, push pace, and make decisions in the open floor. George was prolific at shot creation off the dribble and needed touches and space to operate. And Carmelo Anthony, who had spent his entire career as a volume scoring isolation player, was being asked to reinvent himself as a floor spacer and third option at 33 years old. And they wanted him to come off the bench.
Hey, P, they said I got to come off the bench.
He couldn't do it. He shot 35% from 3, which was respectable, but he looked disinterested defensively and most of the time offensively when he wouldn't get touches. He was a liability in stretches, especially for a team that needed contribution from their 3rd star. Coach Billy Donovan spent the whole season trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have a clean solution. The trio never looked like a championship caliber unit. They finished 48-34, good enough for the 4th seed, and then drew the Utah Jazz in the first round. The Jazz had a 21-year-old rookie named Donovan Mitchell who had absolutely no fear of the moment.
Mitchell going right at Anthony. There it is.
Hold on, now that's...
And he averaged 28.5 points against OKC's vaunted defense across that series. The Thunder lost in 6 games, with Carmelo averaging under 12 points on 37% shooting, while Mitchell was putting on a show at the other end.
I don't know. I think we missed. I think we all missed.
The aftermath was merciless. Carmelo was traded to Atlanta that summer and immediately bought out. His career as a star-level player effectively finished from that point forward. Paul George, who everyone expected to leave for the Lakers, stunned the league by re-signing with OKC on a 4-year max deal in July of 2018. And then, 1 year later, he reverse-coursed immediately and demanded a trade to the Clippers, which set off a chain of events we already talked about in the last segment. Westbrook was eventually traded to Houston in the summer of 2019, ending an era in Oklahoma City that had promised so much and delivered 1 MVP season and a whole lot of heartbreak. It was a strange, messy conclusion to a franchise that had done everything right for a decade, and the one time they tried to shortcut the process the way everyone else was doing it, they found out pretty quickly why that process existed in the first place. Now, we're gonna take a step back in time, because the next story on this list is the oldest one we've got, and in a lot of ways, it might be the most poetic. Some people actually consider this Houston Rockets team to be one of the first super teams the NBA had ever seen. 3 legends, 3 Hall of Famers, all in the twilight of their careers, all chasing one last shot at a ring. Every franchise that came after them and tried to stack stars in some ways following a blueprint that this team helped write. It didn't end the way any of them had hoped, but the story of how it came together is worth every second. By 1996, the Houston Rockets had already won back-to-back championships in 94 and 95. with Hakeem the Dream as the best player on both of those teams, and Clyde Drexler arriving mid-season in '95 to push them over the top for the second title. Drexler and Hakeem had been college teammates at Houston, and watching them finally win a championship together was one of the feel-good stories of that decade. But the window was closing, the team was aging, and the front office knew that they needed one more piece if they were going to make another run before their time ran out. So in the summer of 1996, they made a phone call to Phoenix, and they traded for Charles Barkley. To get him, they gave up young Robert Horry, Sam Cassell, Chucky Brown, and Mark Bryant. At the time, it felt like a reasonable price to pay for one of the most dominant power forwards the game had ever seen. What nobody fully appreciated in that moment was what they were actually giving away. Cassell was a clutch, savvy point guard who went on to win 2 more championships after leaving Houston. And well, Robert Horry, as y'all know, became one of the most decorated role players in NBA history. He went on to win 5 more rings after that trade. 2 with the Lakers, 2 with the Spurs, and 1 he had already won in Houston before the trade. The man they traded away for Barkley won 5 more championships, man. Let that sink in for a second. But I gotta say, the vision made some sense on paper. Hakeem was 33, Drexler was 34, Barkley was 33, and all 3 of them were still capable of playing at an extremely high level. The 96-97 Rockets went 57-25, one of the best records in the league, and they looked like a real threat to dethrone the Utah Jazz and the Chicago Bulls as the class of the sport. They beat Minnesota in the first round, beat Seattle in a tough second round series, and then ran into Karl Malone and John Stockton in the Western Conference Finals. Utah was in the middle of their 2-year run as the best team in the West. Malone was the MVP that season, and the Jazz beat Houston in 6 games. The defining moment of that series came in Game 6, when Stockton hit a 3-pointer over Barkley to clinch it and send Utah to the NBA Finals. It was a brutal way to go out. The following season, the Rockets declined to 41-41. Drexler announced that he was retiring at the end of the season to take the head coaching job at the University of Houston, and they limped into the playoffs as the 8th seed before losing to Utah again in the first round. Clyde the Glide retired. Barkley played 2 more years in Houston before rupturing his quads in 1999 and retiring himself. And of course, Hakeem was eventually traded to the Toronto Raptors in 2001 for 1 final season before calling it a career. The legacy of this trio is a complicated one. 3 of the 50 greatest players in NBA history, all on the same team, and they never made it back to the finals together. But there's something almost noble about the way it ended. 3 legends who had given everything to the game, trying one last time to reach the mountaintop, falling just short, and walking away with their heads held high. Every super team came after them. Every front office that called a rival and said, let's make a deal, was chasing some version of what this Rockets team represented. The difference is that most of those teams didn't have the grace to fail the way Houston did. Now, I know everybody who's watching this video was waiting for this one, so let's shift back to Los Angeles. This time around, though, the cast of characters is very different. The era is different, and somehow the result is even harder to watch than the last one. By 2020, the Los Angeles Lakers were back on top of the basketball world. LeBron James and Anthony Davis had just won the NBA championship in the bubble, delivering the franchise its first title in a decade and reminding everyone that when those two were healthy and locked in, they were one of the most dominant duos the sport had to offer. The following season, they lost in the first round to the Phoenix Suns, with both LeBron and Davis dealing with injuries that compromised the whole team down the stretch. It was a disappointing exit, but the core was still intact, and the expectation was that they would bounce back and compete again the next year. Oh boy, but what happened next is one of the most baffling roster decisions of the modern era. In August of 2021, the Lakers traded for Russell Westbrook. They sent Kyle Kuzma, Montrezl Harrell, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, and a first-round pick to Washington to bring in a player who had built his entire legacy on being Mr. Triple-Double, one of the most statistically overwhelming guards the game had ever produced. On the surface, it looked like the move that would push LA back into title contention. In reality, though, it was one of the worst fits in NBA history.
What I'm disappointed with Westbrook is I thought he was going to come with all this energy, get the rebound, go coast to coast. We haven't seen a lot of that.
Let's just be real here. The problem was fundamental, and it was visible from the very first week of the NBA season. LeBron James, even at 37, needed the ball in his hands to operate effectively. Anthony Davis needed space in the paint and clean pick and rolls to dominate. And Russell Westbrook, whose entire game was built around attacking the rim with the ball, pushing pace in transition, and making decisions at full speed, needed the ball too. When you have 3 players on one team that need the ball, it's not going to work out. We've seen this time and time again. They even managed to bring in Carmelo Anthony midway through the season. The same Carmelo who had just been through his own failed super team experience in Oklahoma City, hoping that he could provide some veteran scoring off the bench. Westbrook wasn't a shooter. He shot just 29% from 3 that season, which meant the floor spacing the Lakers desperately needed from their point guard was never there. Every time Westbrook touched the ball in a half-court set, the offense ground to a halt, and the frustration on both sides was impossible to hide. Head coach Frank Vogel spent the entire season trying to solve a problem that had no clear clean solution, rotating Westbrook in and out of lineups, experimenting with different closing units, and reportedly dealing with an increasingly fractured locker room dynamic. The Lakers finished 33-49, missing the play-in tournament entirely, which is the first time LeBron James had missed the postseason since his second year in the league back in 2005. For a franchise that had just won a championship 2 years earlier, it was a disappointing collapse. And I'm sure you guys remember it like it was yesterday. Westbrook was catching all of the blame.
And he shoots it so high up, he hits the tip top of the backboard. And again, demoralized.
Where you know, my name is getting shamed, it becomes a issue.
The aftermath got messy in a hurry. Head coach Vogel was fired. Darvin Ham was brought in as the new head coach. Westbrook opted into his $47 million player option for the following season and was moved to the bench, where he actually played a more positive role as a sixth man. But the damage to the roster's identity had already been done. The Lakers eventually moved him in February of 2023 in a 3-team deal that brought back D'Angelo Russell, Malik Beasley, and Jared Vanderbilt. And almost immediately, that team looked like a different unit. They went on a run that carried them all the way to the Western Conference Finals that same season, which in a strange way made the whole Westbrook era even more frustrating to look back on, because the talent was clearly there, it just needed the right pieces around it. They ended up getting swept in the conference finals by the Denver Nuggets, but still, he got the brunt of the blame. The Westbrook experiment costed the Lakers a first-round pick, a season of LeBron's prime at 37, which is crazy to say, and 2 years of organizational dysfunction that set the franchise back in ways that are still being untangled. It stands as the clearest example of what happens when front offices prioritize star power and name recognition over fit, over the basic basketball question of how do these players actually work together on the floor. And that's what this video has been about. The answer in this case was that they didn't, and everybody saw it coming except the people who made the deal. And the Lakers weren't the only team that learned that lesson the hard way during this era. Because over in New York, Madison Square Garden was hosting its own version of this exact same story. New York City is the biggest stage in basketball, even though they haven't won anything since 1973, but shout out that NBA Cup though, right? Anyways, for the Knicks fans who spent the better part of 2 decades watching their franchise stumble through bad trades, worse contracts, and one embarrassing offseason after another, the early 2010s felt like something was finally changing. And it started with Amari Stoudemire, who signed a 5-year, nearly $100 million deal in the summer of 2010 and immediately brought life back to Madison Square Garden. He was explosive, he was dynamic, and he gave the city something it hadn't had in years. But everyone watching knew Amari alone wasn't enough. The Knicks needed a star, and in February of 2011, they went and got one. They traded everything for Carmelo Anthony. And the price was steep. Denver got Wilson Chandler, Raymond Felton, Danilo Gallinari, Timofey Mozgov, a first-round pick, and cash, all for one guy who said he was joining the Knicks in free agency that following summer, which limited the Knicks' leverage in the negotiation. And Denver milked every last drop of it. But at the time, the city didn't care about the cost. Carmelo Anthony was a Knick. Madison Square Garden was electric again. And for the first time in a long time, the Knicks felt relevant.
Anthony for 3. Bang! That one goes down, and the game is tied. Anthony for 3. Puts it in! Knicks by 1 with 8.2 remaining.
Then in December of 2011, they ended up adding Tyson Chandler, who had just won a championship with the Dallas Mavericks and was coming off one of the best defensive seasons any center had produced in years. He won Defensive Player of the Year that season with the Knicks, brought toughness and edge to a roster that had always been soft at the center position. And suddenly, New York had something that looked like a real big three. Carmelo scoring from everywhere, Amari as the athletic big man who could play in space, and Chandler anchoring the defense and cleaning up the glass. The best version of this team showed up in the 2012-2013 season. They went 54-28. Their best record in almost 2 decades, won the Atlantic Division for the first time since 1994, and Carmelo Anthony led the entire league in scoring at 28.7 points per game. The Garden was as loud as it had been since the Patrick Ewing era. Knicks fans were genuinely dreaming about a deep playoff run. They beat the Boston Celtics in the first round, and their first playoff series win since the year 2000. Then they ran into the Indiana Pacers in the second round, and that dream died fast. The Pacers were physical and suffocating defensively, with Roy Hibbert protecting the paint in a way that neutralized everything the Knicks wanted to do inside. New York ended up losing in 6 games, and it wasn't particularly close by the end. That series exposed everything that was fragile about this roster. Amari's knees had been broken since before the season started, quietly taking away the athleticism that made him so dangerous. Melo's constant ISO play, which worked well in the regular season, kept running into brick walls against a defense built specifically to contain a player like him.
Anthony attacks. Hibbert denies him at the rim.
And unfortunately for them, the following season, it all unraveled. They fell to 37-45, and the Big Three era in New York was over just as quickly as it began. Tyson Chandler was traded back to Dallas. Amari's contract became one of the most painful albatrosses in the league as his knees gave out completely and played just 47 games over his final 2 seasons with the team. Carmelo signed a 5-year max extension and oversaw 5 straight losing seasons before the Knicks finally moved on from him in 2017. Phil Jackson came in as GM, tried to convince them to run the triangle, feuded with Carmelo publicly, and made everything so much worse. It was a full organizational collapse that took years to dig out from. The cruelest part of the whole story is how close it felt in that 2013 season. 54 wins, the best record the franchise had seen in a generation, and they still couldn't get out of the second round. For a city that bleeds basketball the way New York does, that kind of almost is sometimes harder to swallow than never getting there at all. And we saved the last story for a team that didn't just fail to get out of the second round. They failed to win a single playoff game. Nearly $630 million spent, 2 head coaches fired, and not one playoff series victory to show for any of it. It's time to talk about the Phoenix Suns, a franchise that had already been to the finals as recently as 2021 with Devin Booker leading the way. They decided in the winter of 2023 that they were done being close and ready to win right now. And when your owner says that, you should probably run in the opposite direction. New owner Matt Ishbia had just taken over that franchise from Robert Sarver. He had deep pockets and even deeper ambition. And the first thing he did was authorize one of the most aggressive roster overhauls the league had ever seen. It started with none other than Kevin Durant. Brooklyn was in full meltdown mode after February of 2023. KD had already requested a trade the previous summer, and Phoenix swooped in and gave the Nets everything they asked for. Mikal Bridges, Cam Johnson, Jay Crowder, 4 unprotected first-round picks, and a pick swap. Mikal Bridges was one of the most beloved players in Phoenix, a homegrown fan favorite who had been a part of that 2021 finals run, and they shipped him out overnight for a 34-year-old Durant who had spent the last 3 years watching his Brooklyn super team implode.
Yeah, I mean, it's KD. I get it. Like, I 100% get it. That's just how it is. Like,
the city was shocked, but the excitement was undeniable. Then a few months later, they decided to go out and get Bradley Beal from Washington. Beal came with a 5-year, $251 million max contract and the only no-trade clause in the entire NBA. What he also came with, though nobody wanted to say it loudly at the time, was a history of injuries that had limited his availability for years and a skill set that overlapped heavily with both Durant and Booker. 3 guys, all of whom needed the ball. All of whom were at their best creating off the dribble in isolation situations. Where have we heard that before, huh? The spacing concerns were real and they were obvious, but Phoenix was swinging for the fences and nobody was going to pump the brakes now. The financial commitment alone was staggering. Over the 2 seasons this trio played together, the Suns spent nearly $630 million in combined salary and luxury tax. $630 million. That's more than some NBA franchises have spent in their entire existence. They hired Frank Vogel as head coach, the same Frank Vogel the Lakers had just fired after the Westbrook disaster. And when that didn't work, they went and hired Mike Budenholzer, 2 championship-winning coaches, back-to-back, and neither one of them could make this roster function. The on-court product was just as painful to watch. Beal struggled to find his footing as a third option. The spacing was as problematic as everyone feared, and injuries ravaged the roster in the worst possible moments. Durant was still capable of brilliance and stretches, but couldn't drag a broken system to the finish line by himself. Booker, to his credit, kept competing, kept showing up, and kept shouldering the burden of a situation that was deteriorating around him. In the 2024 playoffs, they drew the Minnesota Timberwolves in the first round and got swept 4-0. The following season was even worse. They couldn't even make it out of the play-in tournament, finishing 11th in the West at 36-46. Durant left in the final stretch of the season with an ankle injury and didn't come back. Budenholzer was fired, and just like that, the most expensive Big Three in NBA history was done. Having won, let's see, exactly 0 playoff series together. Durant was eventually traded to Houston in a massive 7-team deal that summer. Beal was bought out and signed with the Clippers. Booker re-signed and is still in Phoenix, trying to rebuild something from all of that wreckage. The last man standing from an era that cost the franchise its future and delivered nothing in return. But hey, at least they sell $2 hot dogs in the arena, right? And that right there is the story of the Big Three era in the NBA. 10 rosters, hundreds of millions of dollars, locker room drama, coaching changes, and player demands. From Kobe's torn Achilles to Kyrie's personal situation. From the picks that became Tatum and Brown to the money Phoenix flushed into a trio that never figured it out. The pattern is always the same. And the brutal reality that talent alone has never been enough. The teams that actually won, the ones with the banners hanging up in the rafters, they had the right fit, they had patience, and they had the players who were willing to sacrifice something for the guy next to them. That sounds simple. In the NBA, it is anything but. 10 teams that believed, 10 cities that dreamed, and 10 rosters that reminded the entire league that in this sport, putting great players together is the easy part. Making it work is a completely different story. If you guys enjoyed this one, hit that like button and please, 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 please subscribe. And if you have some extra time, I think you'll love the videos that are on the screen right now. And if you want a daily NBA podcast to listen to, be sure to subscribe to our podcast channel, Jay-Z Courtside. That link will be down below. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.